Okay, so welcome to the exhibit. I think the exhibit's very timely. First off, it's timely to be here at the Skyscraper Museum because one of the things I argue is that this is the world's largest concentration of skyscraper factories. And I don't think we always think of the garment district as skyscrapers, but they are pretty tall buildings, as we will see. It's timely because, as a lot of you know, the Business Improvement District, the Fashion District bid, has put out an RFP to change the name. They want to change the name of the neighborhood. So this is in the news a lot. The Design Trust for Public Spaces is going to come out with a report in September about trying to preserve the industrial economy in the area. So there's a lot of thinking going on in the garment district. A study of the New York garment industry published in 1959 opens by noting that put the American woman on a subway train going from Pennsylvania Station to Times Square and it will take her just 65 seconds to pass completely under the district that gives her the reputation of being the best dressed woman in the world. So this is a tiny area, 35th Street to 41st Street, from 6th Avenue to 9th Avenue, and not even all of that, but those are the widest boundaries. That by the end of the 1920s was home to 1/2 of the city's garment plants and probably 2/3 of the city's garment workers, all crowded into less than 4% of the area of New York, or 0.3% of 4% of the area of Manhattan, 0.3% of the area of New York City. But the importance of the area to the history and character of New York, I think, outweighs the diminutive boundaries of the area. Indeed, I think there are few places in New York that are more wedded to the 20th century history and legend of New York than the garment district. And New Yorkers, especially New Yorkers who grew up in the city before the garment industry sort of ebbed away in the last 3 decades of the 20th century, when you ask somebody about the garment district, they can tell you things about it. They can tell you about the ILGWU and labor issues, and they can tell you, let's see, is this working now?
Yeah, it's not a remote, you just say next.
Oh, just say next, okay. A magic remote. Okay, or I think the most vivid image that people have are of the carts and racks of dresses being pushed by people that are known as push boys. Doesn't matter how old they are, they were always push boys. Can I have the next? But if you ask people about the architecture, I think they give you a blank stare because people don't really focus on what the architecture of the garment district was. Virtually nothing has been written about the physical fabric of the garment district since these buildings were first erected in the 1920s, except for a book by Jules Stern on Eli Jacques Kahn, an architect whom we'll talk about, who designed a lot of buildings in the district. Little was known about the district's architecture, about the architects, about the builders, about the forces that led to the development of the area. So these are the things that piqued my interest to find out about. None of the buildings in the garment district are landmarks, not one. And in the 1,055-page, seemingly comprehensive AIA Guide to New York does not mention even one garment district building, which to me is really shocking. So why have we been so negligent in appreciating the physical fabric of the garment district? Partly, I think, because the labor history has kind of outshone the physical fabric. It's very compelling, the labor history. Also, I think because these are vernacular buildings, these are kind of the everyday utilitarian buildings of the city that are so typical of New York that we don't really notice them. And this is something that has become my biggest interest is understanding the everyday buildings of New York and making them more noticeable to people, because this really is the fabric of New York. The fabric of New York is not McKinley and White, really. That's a minor thing. This is the fabric that makes up New York. Thus, my objective tonight is to take a look at this extraordinary neighborhood that rapidly developed and rapidly transformed an area of New York. So I'm going to focus on the creation of the district, the first buildings in the district, which were known as the Garment Center Capital, how the district came to be in the area, and what the character of the architecture in the area is. But first, just a little background about New York's place in the manufacturing of clothing. When ready-to-wear clothing is a 19th century industrial revolution invention, first for menswear. And menswear, can I have the next? Menswear was in New York. although New York never dominated the menswear industry in the way that it would dominate the ladies' and children's clothing industry, which is really what we're going to be talking about. Menswear begins to become ready-to-wear in the mid-19th century, and you can see these are two New York menswear businesses. So, and then by the latter part of the 19th century, women's wear also begins to become factory produced, and that really centers in New York. So why does women's wear center in New York? I think that one thing is the harbor, that New York has one of the world's great harbors, so it was a convenient place for the importation of raw materials like silk and wool and other raw materials that were brought in, and it was easy to export the finished goods by boat, by canal, by rail, and then later in the 20th century by truck. Also, the harbor was where immigrants arrived, and this was an immigrant industry, as we talk about in the exhibition. So this was a place where immigrants arrived, and many of them stayed here, and they worked in the garment district as laborers. They became the owners of the factories. They became the builders of the buildings. So the whole range of people that worked in the garment district were immigrants. Also, New York was a major capital center, so the banks and insurance companies were here for lending money. Also, New York was a publishing center. It was a media center from the 19th century. Can I have the next? So the fashion magazines were published here in New York. New York was very closely connected to what was going on in Paris and elsewhere in Europe, also because of the port. And so New York became the arbiter of fashion in America. The development of loft buildings designed primarily or exclusively for the garment district begins in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, as the demand for ready-to-wear clothing, especially women's clothing, expands. I divide the history of the industrial production, the placemaking of the garment industry into 4 phases. The first phase, probably the most famous phase for most people, is manufacture and tenement sweatshops. This is the earliest phase of the garments where a contractor where a garment manufacturer chose the fabric, designed the clothing, cut the fabric, and sent it out to contractors working in tenements. Immigrants, the contractor, and the workers working side by side, being paid by the piece. This is the most famous image. I'm sure a lot of you know this famous Jacob Riis image. I want to know how many of you noticed that there's a dog hiding under the chair over here. This was really startling to me when I noticed that. It looks like somebody photoshopped him in, but he's actually real. He's actually there. So this is the first phase. By the 1890s, reformers were pressing for the abolition of tenement sweatshops, and laws were passed that made it very difficult to manufacture at home. And so, can I have the next? So, factory sweatshops begin to appear. A lot of the tenement sweatshops move out into old loft buildings, like in Soho, for example, where conditions weren't really very good either. And this is a photograph from about 1910. Of one of these factory sweatshops. The first wave of garment loft construction took place on and just off of Broadway, west of Washington Square. A lot of these are NYU buildings now, and also a little bit around Union Square. Can I have the next? These include the Geraldine building. These are 2 drawings that are on that wall over there. Alfred Zucker was the major architect of this first generation of loft buildings. These were modern, fireproof buildings, but fireproof is an insurance term that meant only that the building would not be destroyed by fire. Can I have the next? It had nothing to do with saving human lives. And this became evident in 1911 when the Triangle Waste Company fire in the fireproof Ash building. And here you can see the Ash building. It's now an NYU building. And here during the fire, the building was, because of this tragic fire, just a little over 100 years ago, people understood what the flaws were, and a whole series of reform laws were passed following that. The building was fireproof, but this only meant that the building would survive a fire, not that the workers would survive. As a writer for a magazine called Safety Engineering, a fire insurance journal noted that after the Triangle fire, the so-called fireproof buildings are fireproof only in the sense that a conflagration does not seriously damage the structure. We must add the term fireproof to the term fireproof, the terms death-proof and conflagration proof. I should note that the fire insurance industry had been pleading for a long time for laws mandating sprinklers, and they had been ignored, of course, because it would have cost money to put in sprinklers. Can I have the next? And as you can see, if you look up here, the building, this is right after the fire at the Triangle. The building, there's a lot of debris, but the building looks in pretty good condition. And can I have the next? And this is a year later, when this is the same scene, and a clothing firm has moved back into the building. It's really shocking to me to look at these two images, because the building was fireproof. I should note there are sprinklers. Here, there's a sprinkler right there. So it was a safer place to be. Reformers and labor groups, can I have the next? Reformers and labor groups had campaigned against the overcrowded conditions in the loft factories, and the fire insurance industry had long advocated for the installation of automatic sprinklers and wire glass windows, which would have saved lives as well as property. But before the Triangle fire, these demands had fallen on deaf ears. Since the real estate industry was closely connected with Tammany Hall, and no reform laws were ever passed. But by the early 20th century, the women's garment industry was expanding north onto and along Broadway, up into the Ladies' Mile. You can see that here. Some of the buildings in this area pre-Triangle, so these were fireproof buildings in the old sense, and only after the fire were they forced to put sprinklers in these buildings. These buildings, this is what I call the third wave of lofts. These are basically 12-story buildings with stone bases, brick above, built right out to the lot line, rising right up. They take a form that really became quite popular for loft buildings in New York. Could I have the next? And you can see sprinklers were put in to the buildings following the fire. This is an interesting image, because some of you may have seen some of the specials about the Triangle fire last year that were on PBS. And this image was used to show what the factories looked like before the fire. And I was apoplectic at home, because of course there's a sprinkler there. And if there had only been a sprinkler, it wouldn't, all those workers would not have been killed. So they were really completely out of it when they did this. Everyone was not, so can I have the next? So garment lofts are moving northward. Up the city, especially as the industry is growing. Everybody was not thrilled about this increase in the number of garment lofts. That were moving into the Ladies' Mile, which was where the elegant department stores were. The location of the new lofts was convenient for the manufacturers, but problematic for the luxury store owners, especially at noon, when the male workers, not the women, just the men, went out to lunch. And they congested the streets. So you can see that here on 5th Avenue and 18th Street at 12:30, completely congested. And you'll notice all of the factory workers are dressed in jackets and ties, suits and ties with boater hats. So everybody dressed up to go to work. In 1914, Robert Greer Cook, who was the president of the 5th Avenue Association, described the scene. Once these factories became firmly established, the character of 5th Avenue changed. The noonday crowds, numbering tens of thousands, filled the sidewalks, overflowing into the street and practically blockading the avenue from 15th to 23rd Street for an hour on every working day. This made shopping difficult. Entrances to the stores and offices could be reached only by vigorous pushing methods, and naturally men and women preferred to do business in neighborhoods where they did not have to fight their way through dense masses. So the department stores decamped, and they moved north of 34th Street. Go to the next. Here you can see some of these garment lofts that are just continuing to move north here on 25th Street, here on 26th Street. Go to the next. And then eventually, the factories are beginning to move north of 34th Street as well, as you can see here. Can I have the next? And here, these maps, two of which we have up in the case here, really show you both the migration of the industry and the size of the businesses. The larger the circle, the larger the number of employees. In 1900, the ladies' clothing industry is south of 14th Street, here in Soho and along Broadway and Greenwich Village. Then you can see it's up just north and south of 23rd Street. And then there's this huge, dense cluster here. And then, is this a pointer?
No.
No. And then all the way on the top, all the way on the top, they've gone north of 34th Street. It talks to me. So you can see there's a cluster of loft buildings now north of 34th Street. So can I have the next? The problem was that Altman's opens on 34th Street in 1907, just at the same time and Tiffany's follows soon after. Can I have the next? Just as the garment lofts are here. And so right away there's this fear that the same thing is going to happen. All those garment workers are going to be cluttering up Fifth Avenue during the noon hour, which was a really prime time for wealthy women to go out shopping. And so this became a problem. In January 1916, a provocative headline in the New York Times, can I have the next? Spoke of menace to trade on Fifth Avenue, noting the northward invasion of factories and the belief that if no restriction is put on this invasion, we may confidentially expect to see Fifth Avenue ruined for retail purposes as far north as 42nd Street within 10 years. Again, it's the issue of congestion on Fifth Avenue that has everybody really upset. It was finally the merchants on Fifth Avenue and their allies who forced the garment industry to abandon the streets off of Fifth Avenue. These merchants campaigned for the 1916 zoning law that was to establish use districts in New York, but it was not the zoning law that forced garment manufacturing to move, because all of these factories that were north of 34th Street would have been grandfathered in. Since it was another campaign. Could I have the next? On March 5th, 1916, a committee called the Shall We Save New York Committee published this ad in every newspaper in New York. I found it in every newspaper I've looked in, including Womenswear, so it was in the industry as well. Shall we save New York? This campaign begins, a vital question to everyone who has pride in this great city. The ad was signed by all the major department and specialty stores in the area, and you can see that, Macy's and Arnold Constable's and Altman's and Bonwitz. The firms gave notice that beginning in February of 1917, they would boycott any garment factory that was manufacturing in a zone bounded by 33rd and 59th Street between 3rd and 7th Avenues. They received the support of department stores outside of New York, of banks who said they wouldn't give mortgages to build lofts in the area. You can see there are banks here, of hotels, clubs, wealthy people, a lot of prominent people and businesses signed on to this boycott campaign. This strong statement, with its powerful backers, certainly caught the attention of the garment industry, and they rapidly acquiesced to the idea of moving. Partly because they were getting a lot of really bad publicity. The garment workers were portrayed in the newspapers as a menace, a nuisance, and a blight, and objectionable crowds of idlers. The New York Sun characterized the workers as, quote, a giant human glacier that drifts restlessly up and down Fifth Avenue. Those who only read the daily newspapers would believe that the support for the campaign was unanimous, because all the newspapers editorialized about this. But the owners of the new loft buildings could not have been very happy with the prospect of losing their tenants, and there were many manufacturers who had leases extending past the boycott date. There was only one vocal opponent who was willing to go on record by name. This was a realtor named Nathan Ottinger, who noted the self-serving nature of the Shall We Save New York campaign, which he said, plainly on the surface will accrue to the benefit of one class of people and to the detriment of another. And he was especially irked by the hypocrisy of the department stores, which actually ran garment factories inside the department stores, and their workers contributed to the congestion. And so he really calls them out on this. Nonetheless, the garment manufacturers acquiesced to the Save New York Committee's demands, and why not? They were paying high rents, and it wasn't very difficult to move sewing machines and the other machinery. It's pretty light industry. But they had one condition, and that is that there had to be a place where they could move. They didn't want to move back into the decrepit older buildings. They wanted new buildings in which they could move. So there's a lot of discussion of where the garment industry is going to move, and then World War I intervenes, and nothing happens. Kind of the next. And then in 1918, the Save New York Committee comes up with a proposal to move the industry to between 17th and 34th Streets, between 6th and 8th Avenues, actually where the fur, partly this becomes the fur district later on. However, it was the ladies' garment manufacturers themselves who decided that where they were going to move, not the Save New York Committee. Can I have the next? They decided to move onto blocks centering on 7th Avenue. And that's because the area around 7th Avenue had a number of advantages for them. The area was, first of all, convenient to the subways. A series of new subway lines had opened. The West Side IRT south of Times Square had just opened, and the BMT, the R and the N trains onto Broadway had just opened. And they connected to the new neighborhoods in Brooklyn and the Bronx where the garment workers were beginning to move. They were moving out of the Lower East Side and they were moving out to Brooklyn and the Bronx. And so they could take the subway easily to this new area. Also, it was very close to Penn Station. So it was convenient to the buyers who were a crucial part of the industry, the out-of-town buyers who came regularly throughout the year to buy goods to stock department and specialty stores all around. And also, kind of the next, real estate was fairly cheap in this area. This area was the Tenderloin. It was a part of the Tenderloin, which was a deteriorated area of tenements, low-rise tenements and old row houses with a mixed population of European immigrants and African Americans. And if you look, everybody wants to look at Penn Station, but ignore Penn Station for a minute and look to the right, and you can see a piece of the Tenderloin. And here, in this Hewson Hawley drawing, which we have reproduced on the wall over there, this is the Tenderloin here. It's all in a blur, actually, in the original, but it shows you the low-rise character of the area where the garment district decided to move. No concern was ever voiced about displacing the poor from the rapidly changing district. Indeed, few commentators even noted that there was anything in the area before the garment lofts arrived. The New York Tribune, for example, stated that the blocks west of 7th Avenue were, quote, a vast unoccupied area. Can I have the next? The turning point for the garment district came in December 1919 when the New York Times declared the establishment of a new center for the cloak and suit trade of New York has been definitely decided upon. The decision was the result of the announcement that a cooperative syndicate of cloak and suit and dress manufacturers would build the Garment Center Capital, as it was to be known, 2 loft structures on 7th Avenue flanking 37th Street. And you can see them here in a drawing and here right after they were finished. And you are forgiven if you don't know the Garment Center Capitol buildings, because they could not be more innocuous works of architecture, despite the fact that they were described at the time as being in the Italian Renaissance style. You have to use your imagination there. But there is a little tiny bit of Renaissance ornament on them. But I think that these are 2 of the most important buildings in the social, economic, and cultural history of New York, because they're the beginning they established the idea of the 7th Avenue Garment District. Can I have the next? The idea for this cooperatively built complex was that of cloak and suit manufacturer Saul Singer and dress manufacturer Mack Caner. And this is an important aspect of the garment district in that most of the buildings were built by people who started as garment manufacturers. They were successful garment manufacturers who then closed their shops and became real estate developers. And these people built a lot of the major buildings in the area. Can I have the next? The Garment Center Capitol buildings are enormous L-shaped structures, one stretching back 225 feet and the other 275 feet from 7th Avenue. They were designed by a little-known architect named Walter Mason. They were planned to house multiple firms with profitable rental offices and showrooms on the 4 lower floors. Actually, shops on the lowest floor, 3 stories of showrooms, and then the factories and showrooms of the cooperative owners on the floors above. Can I have the next? The rented showrooms were extremely elegant, often designed by prominent architects and interior decorators who were commissioned by the individual firms to do this. Some of these were New York firms that moved their showrooms into this building because it was prestigious, and others, kind of the next, were out-of-town companies, out-of-town manufacturers who understood that if they were going to sell their goods, they needed a presence in New York. So they would open up a showroom in New York. So this is a company from Cleveland. And if you think that the misspelling of words for marketing is a recent thing, like quick copy with a KWIK, they made correct addresses with a K over here. The Garment Center Capital was designed to be the most efficient garment manufacturing and showroom building in New York, as well as a building that would save the manufacturers money. Of paramount importance in the design of the building were fireproofing, ventilation, and flexible floor space. Can I have the next? The building was constructed with a steel frame and with concrete floors and with ceilings reinforced with wire mesh. Concrete was fireproof, vibration-proof, and vermin-proof, all of which were really important for the garment industry. Up-to-date sprinkler systems were installed. There were 4,800 windows of fireproof hollow metal construction which lit the floors. The floors had open space punctuated by structural columns. Could I have the next? Elegant entrance lobbies were designed for the white-collar workers only. The manufacturing workers came in through the freight elevators. They never used this lobby. Can I have the next? Elevators were situated in such a way that the floors could easily be subdivided. So somebody could rent a whole floor, a half a floor, or they could be divided in different ways. There were two entrances. This is a bank of passenger elevators, and that's a bank of passenger elevators. And these are the freight elevators over here. And you can see they face in two different directions, making it very easy to subdivide the space. Behind the scenes, the complex had a central heating plant. Can I have the next? Each building had a driveway extending from one street through to the next for delivery trucks and garbage trucks. This was part of an effort, can I have the next? This was part of an effort to decrease truck congestion in the street. This is one of the memorable things about the garment district, is how congested it was with trucks. So by having loading and unloading in the buildings, it made things a lot easier for the people in the buildings. Can I have the next? In order to solve another problem of congestion, and that is boxes piled up on the streets waiting to be picked up by the Railroad Express Company, they put chutes in the building. This is probably the first building that had package chutes. And you can see those circular things. Those are the package chutes. And this is the door. I missed the package chutes by about 2 or 3 months. They had all been ripped out right before I got into the building. But this is the door to one of the package chutes here. So, and then they went down into the basement where they were sorted and put on trucks. Cut the next. The top floors of one of the buildings, were set aside for an employer's club, complete with a gymnasium, squash courts, a lounge, and a neoclassical dining room that seated 750 people, which you can see here. Could I have the next? And this survived until about a year ago. The space survived until about a year ago. Unfortunately, it's now been ripped out. But you can see a very elegant detail. And this hat maker was in one of the squash courts until relatively recently. For the workers, the syndicate sponsored a hospital and dental clinic. The Garment Center Capital opened in July 1921. It was the largest garment manufacturing center in the world. Because this was a cooperative building, the cooperative negotiated low electric rates, fire insurance rates, hired a detective agency to watch the property, and even organized centralized buying. They would go to Paris and buy a whole line of clothing that all of the different firms could look at, imitate, adapt. It was cheaper than each firm buying its own. And indeed, it was an enormous success, both in its own right and as a catalyst for the transformation of the neighborhood. Can I have the next? And here's the fourth of this series of maps. And if you look in the upper left, that's the Garment Center Capital. That cluster with all the large dark circls mean that these were large firms. So you can see it's beginning to shift to the west towards 7th Avenue. Even before the completion of the Garment Center Capital, other garment loft buildings were under construction in the 7th Avenue area. Dress manufacturer Abraham E. Lefcourt, who would become the largest developer in the garment district, soon had the large Lefcourt Marlborough building under construction, which you see on the left. While cloak and suit manufacturer Max Aronson had 2 buildings under construction on West 36th Street, one of which you can see over here, which immediately attracted garment firms so that the area was called the New Garment Center, and you can see that in this ad for the Aronson building underlined. It says it's the new garment center. Both Lefcourt and Aronson soon closed their factories and focused on real estate. In 1922, the New York Times reported that 8 or 10 new 14-story loft buildings would open in the district in the fall, attracting many firms whose leases were expiring in the Fifth Avenue district. And in 1924, the Record and Guide proclaimed, old-time dwellings and buildings that served their usefulness long ago are rapidly being replaced with modern skyscrapers devoted to one or more of the industries most identified with the glorification of femininity. Can I have the next? Between 1920 and 1930, over 130 high-rise manufacturing and showroom buildings were erected for the garment trade between 35th and 41st Streets, 6th and 9th Avenues. 28 were begun in 1925 alone. Can I have the next? The Tenderloin was displaced with extraordinary speed, possibly the fastest change of any neighborhood in New York. And here you can see some of the old row houses that had become tenements being demolished. They're already surrounded by lofts. And these are going to be replaced by a loft. Can I have the next? So rapidly had the garment center blocks changed from residential to industrial that in 1925 the Church of the Holy Innocents, once a thriving Catholic parish, had to close its school and convert the building into offices. A Herald Tribune headline read, "Old Midtown District has turned into childless village." Can I have the next? While Singer and Kaner chose an obscure designer for the garment center capital, most developers worked with architects who were better known at the time, even if they are not household names today. 23 lofts were designed by Schwartz and Gross, including those by Aronson. 19 were designed by George and Edward Blum, a household name in Susan Tunick in my household, because we wrote a book about George and Edward Blum. Including the Blums worked on several buildings by Lefcourt, including the Lefcourt Marlborough building. And other buildings were designed by other architects who aren't really very well known today: Gronenberg and Luchtig, Sugarman and Berger, Emery Roth, a little bit better known, and Charles Myers. What these men had in common was the fact that, like the builders themselves, like the builders and developers of the buildings, they were all Jewish immigrants. And I think it's one of the interesting things about this area is that at every level, from the owners of the property, the owners of the building, the builders, the architects, the owners of the firms, and the workers were almost entirely, at least in the early years, in the 1920s and 30s, were almost entirely Eastern European Jewish immigrants. So what characterizes the cluster of loft buildings erected during this brief period? All had to conform to the zoning law. Can I have the next? Although the zoning regulations governing height and setback were promulgated primarily to regulate the design of office skyscrapers in Lower Manhattan, in fact it was the physical form of the garment district that was most affected by the requirements of the 1916 zoning law, because this entire dense array of new buildings were all built under the zoning law. The zoning required setbacks as the buildings rose in height, and of course, each builder wanted to get the maximum amount of floor space allowed under the code. With these requirements, however, some developers were able to erect buildings massed in quite a dramatic manner. Can I have the next? One of the things that I discovered, I spent some time a couple of weeks ago looking at all the Blum buildings and then at all the Schwartz and Gross buildings. And one thing that I discovered was that they each had their own way of fulfilling the requirements of the zoning law. George and Edward Blum went for very vertical, asymmetrical buildings, and you can see that they all have every one of them has a sort of tower-like form, here on the left, here on the corner on 8th Avenue, and here on the right at the Gilbert building, which I have a panel about the Gilbert building over here. So they're massing their buildings in a dramatic asymmetrical manner. Could I have the next? Well, Schwartz and Gross went for symmetry in their designs, and so they have a very central emphasis, and you get this kind of cascading central pavilion on the building, and then the recesses to either side. And you can see this at the top of one of their buildings and on this real estate prospectus, which is in one of the cases over there. In addition, builders sought to erect each building as economically as possible. Issues of floor space flexibility, fireproofing, and efficiency were paramount. Many of the buildings were erected on an enormous scale, up to 17 stories in height in the mid-blocks and taller on the avenue, some over 40 stories. All of fireproof construction with sprinklers and adequate exits. Can I have the next? Together, the dense concentration of loft buildings created a spectacular high-rise industrial complex unique in America. Truly, I would say here that old preservation adage is true, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The buildings generally have 2- or 3-story bases of stone and with iron around the storefronts. And these were, there are stores on the first floor. This is very expensive. These are often leased out to luncheonettes, to firms that sold thread and buttons or did sewing machine repairs. Stores that needed to be seen were paid the rents for the ground floor. And then these were usually lofts, factory lofts, or showrooms here, often with letters in the windows so that you could read them from the street. So you could advertise these firms from the street. You can still see that in a few places around in the area. Could I have the next? Surprisingly, very few of the buildings are ornamented with detail that has anything to do with the garment district. I've only found 2 buildings that have ornament that's specific to fashion issues. This is the Emery Roth's Fashion Tower. Roth designed 3 loft buildings. I particularly love the polychrome terracotta peacocks. Peacocks are traditionally a symbol of women's fashion. You see them on upscale women's boutiques sometimes in the 20s and the 30s have peacocks on them. And then up above the 6th floor on the right there's a polychrome terracotta woman looking in a mirror, and on the left she's holding a cotton spindle. And then Fashion Tower here, this putai here has shears. They're holding this piece of fabric out, and this one has a palette and paintbrush on it. I love these details. Can I have the next? And this is the only other example that I found. This rather scary-looking cat with the spindle, with the thread rather, spindle over here. Can I have the next? Above the storefronts were brick facades with cascading setbacks, often simply trimmed with terracotta. Can I have the next? The street facades and the rear elevations were articulated by enormous windows admitting light, maximizing light and ventilation. And you can see here, these are the original windows. These are our metal, fireproof metal windows with chicken wire glass. Can I have the next? Owners and their visitors entered the buildings through small but ornate lobbies, often with marble wainscot, ornate plaster ceilings, and bronze elevator doors. Next. The upper floors were planned to be as open as possible and as flexible as possible, with passenger and freight elevators placed where they could service more than one business per floor. Next. It's always important to remember that these buildings were speculative ventures, and the spaces were rented to large numbers of small firms. The garment district was made, especially in the contractor world, were small factories. They employed maybe 20 people, 30 people. They weren't huge factories. So each building housed multiple factories. And you can see that on the lists of companies that you often see in old photographs. I love the phony French names in particular, Clicquot Frocks, or on the painted signs, which still survive, a few of which still survive, which list a lot of the companies that are in the building. Can I have the next? The tenants could then lay out the space as necessary for efficient production. And so you have these big open spaces. Usually close to the windows were long wooden tables where the operators, the people at the sewing machine, sat at both sides of the table. And so you can see this is they're making wax uniforms during World War II in this picture. They're on both sides of a table with sewing machines. Each one has their own light. And there are lights, also ceiling lights, and there is light coming in from the windows as well. And then you can see here in this image, if you look way in the background, there are cutters who are cutting the fabric. Then in the middle distance, there are the sewing machine operators. These are the hand finishers. They're sewing on the buttons and the buckles and such. And then they're pressing the clothing to send it out. So all these different workers are arrayed around these large spaces. Can I have the next? Typical of the new buildings is this one on 35th Street, designed in 1920 by George and Edward Blum in what the Real Estate Record and Builder's Guide called an English Gothic style. Doesn't look too much like King's College Chapel, does it? The report on the building discusses its location near the subway and rail lines, close to hotels, and assured potential tenants that ceiling heights were high, and that there was a maximum window space that assured natural light. As you can see, the building has a 2-story base, a central entrance over here, two freight entrances over here on either side, so that you could easily divide into multiple areas. And a little bit of Gothic detail. Here's a freight entrance. You can see it has a pointed arch. And there's a couple of pointed arches at the towers to either side. Can I have the next? Because the new garment district extended over the zoning use boundaries, factory lofts were not the only buildings erected. The use zones permitted industrial production west of 7th Avenue. 100 feet west of 7th Avenue, you could have 100% industrial buildings. 7th Avenue and Broadway were in a business zone, which meant you could only have 25% in the industry in the building. So this is where the showrooms, the offices and showrooms focused on 7th Avenue and Broadway. These buildings were planned to house offices and showrooms of both local and out-of-town manufacturers and buyers. Because they catered to large numbers of visitors, buyers, designers, and others, they tend to be more elegant than the loft buildings, with more ornate exteriors and with lavish lobbies. Many of these showroom structures were the work of Eli Jacques Kahn. He designed both of these buildings. These are both by Kahn. This is another left court building over here, and here are two of Kahn's lobbies. He designed about 13 buildings in the garment district, some for manufacturers, but most prominently the showroom buildings on 7th Avenue and Broadway. This is the Brick and Casino building, probably the most prominent building in the district. And to my great sadness, when I was out doing some photography there 2 weeks ago, the fins at the top, the whole crown has been beheaded. It's been removed from the building. And unfortunately, all the lobbies are gone as well. They've all been modernized. Have the next. I think it's really important, though, and this I think is a theme for people that are interested in vernacular architecture, that it's not just about the buildings, but it's also about the use of the buildings and the people who use the buildings. That these are buildings in which people worked, that goods were made, that made a contribution to America at large, because most women in America wore clothing that was made in these factories. And you can see there's a wide variety of men and women in the early years, largely, as I mentioned, Eastern European Jews. Then increasingly large numbers of Italian women entered into the industry. By the end of World War II, African American and Puerto Rican workers began coming into the garment industry in large numbers. And then in recent years, as the number of garment workers has declined, though most garment workers have been Latin American and Asian. So you have this constant replenishing of immigrant and migrant workers in the industry. Can I have the next? In 1925, Abraham Lefcourt wrote that an industry with a turnover annually in the hundreds of millions of dollars, the largest in the Empire State, moved in its entirety from one section of the city to another in record-breaking time and completely changed the real estate map of New York. Between 1924 and 1926, the number of firms occupying space in the district expanded from 475 to 1,492, and it continued to grow after that. As a group, the buildings of the garment district are of crucial importance on many levels, in the history of labor, in the history of manufacturing, and in the history of architecture and development too. Builders and manufacturers created a singular type of high-rise urban industrial building in the garment district. Can I have the next? Although the dense masses of workers out for air during their lunch break are gone, and this street, West 35th Street, was closed so that the workers could congregate there. Can I have the next? There is still garment activity in the area. I took these 2 weeks ago. There are still push boys around. Can I have the next? While industrial activity has certainly declined, the physical form of the garment district is unchanged from the 1920s, except for the loss of large numbers of windows and now the beheading of the casino building. The area still plays an important role in New York's economy as a center for fashion design and marketing, and to a lesser extent than previously in manufacturing. Even as the nature of the garment industry evolves, the unique concentration of high-rise factories, a form found nowhere else in the world, survives as an important part of our built heritage. Thank you. So it's not raining yet. It's not raining yet, so I'd be happy to take any questions if people have them. Yes?
Some of the photos definitely show male workers, but most show women, and all your photos of the street and all the ads or the newspaper things about congestion and all that show just men. So the women did what for lunch?
I recommend you look in the second case over here. There's a cartoon by a guy named Wertman who did 6 cartoons a week for the New York World and its successors, and he followed the everyday lives of New York, and he did a lot of garment industry ones. And there's one there, and the women are eating lunch at their sewing machines. And they're talking about basically finding a boyfriend is the caption. But that's it. The women did not go out for the most part. They mostly stayed in.
It
was a custom that the men went out and the women stayed in. And the workers there were both men and women. In the coat and suit industry, where you're dealing with heavy fabrics, most of the sewing machine operators were men. In the dress business, the vast majority of the sewing machine operators were women. The cutters and the pattern makers and the pressers were all men. But then there were women designers, there were women that were involved in ownership of some of the showroom companies.
And did the men make more money allowing them to go out to lunch? Or?
No, because the ILGWU had set wages by people, not by, it wasn't wages by sex. It was a cultural thing, yeah. Susan, yeah?
I was just interested in your comments on Schwartz and Gross and Blum, and I was wondering if there was enough ornament on these buildings to also say that Schwartz and Gross tended toward symmetrical ornament and the Blums asymmetrical.
No, I don't know about the ornament. I would say that the Blums used Gothic more than than Schwartz and Gross did, and that the Gothic lends itself to asymmetry. Or even though the building I showed you actually is a very early Blum building and it's symmetrical, so they hadn't actually perfected their asymmetrical massing yet in that building. But the Gilbert building, which is down over there, that's an asymmetrical building that's only a year later, and it also has Gothic ornament on it. So Schwartz and Gross love classical ornament. Yeah.
Is there a movement to make this a special district?
It keeps on being suggested, but I don't see that it's gonna go very far. I don't think there'd be a lot of support in the district for it. So I suspect the Landmarks Commission I don't think the building owners would be happy with it.
Brooklyn,
well, the building owners weren't very happy with that either. Yeah, I mean, clearly, if you're going to go by the landmarks law, which states that a place shouldn't need a historic district has to have a sense of place. There are a few places that I know that have more of a sense of place than this does, but I wouldn't hold my breath for it. Yeah.
After the 1916 zoning resolution, when they created manufacturing zones, firms like Gore and Silver, if I recall, had some workers. Was there a limit to the number, the size, the amount of workers you might have just for work?
You could have 25% of the total lot of the total building area could be industrial. Now, when you think 25% of the total area, that included the ground floor shops, the halls, the elevators, the bathrooms. What we're talking about is probably upwards of 40% of the rentable space. And on top of that, and I have never seen any reports about whether the city actually ever cracked down on this. Did people limit themselves to 25% in these buildings? Was there more? That I don't know. But 25% was a pretty good amount of space. So there was industry in these buildings as well. Yeah, Michael.
Do you have any thoughts on how it was that an entire industry, just privately organized without any condemnation or tax incentives or anything like that, could just pick itself up and relocate itself seemingly so smoothly?
I think that first of all, it must have had a lot to do with the fact that the owners of all these tenements were being suddenly offered more money than they ever imagined they would get. So they were selling out at rapid rate. It is also an industry that needs to be clustered. I didn't talk about the structure of the industry, but the structure of the industry is very complicated because you have what are called jobbers and contractors. So the jobbers are the people that design the clothing and sell the clothing, but they don't make the clothing, although they were also called manufacturers, but they didn't manufacture anything. And then they sent out everything to the contractors who were on the mid-blocks. And so it was really important that they be close to each other because they needed to visit each other all the time. And they all wanted to gossip with each other about what the latest fashions were. So I think that once the big firms moved, and they moved into the garment center capital, suddenly everybody wanted to be near there. They wanted to be where the buyers could come, and conveniently, it wasn't convenient for the buyers to go running everywhere. So there becomes a demand to centralize, and I think they were able to just buy the land up because the owners of the tenements were not making much money from it. That's as far as I can venture. Yes?
I don't understand the loft aspect of the buildings. It doesn't look like a type of manufacturing that really requires tall ceilings.
No, they don't actually have hugely tall ceilings. The ceilings are maybe 11 feet, 12 feet, but they wanted light. That was the big issue with the tall ceilings. So they have these, huge windows. And if you look in some of the old photographs, or actually in the Wertman cartoons, you can see their pivot windows, and you can see them open. So they bring in ventilation as well. They're very deep spaces, so getting some ventilation in must have been really important. Yes? Yeah, Carolyn.
I'm still worried about the women. And they're allowed out at lunch.
They were allowed, they just didn't go. They chose not to.
Since there were so many, there were huge numbers of young girls and so forth, unmarried women in the garment trades working. Did you find spaces, especially? They had to be accommodating. Just bring a sandwich and.
There were in the early 20th century, when the reform movements were really active. There were a few factories that had lunchrooms, and these were very large factories that had lunchrooms. They were factories that employed 200 or 300 people. But these firms, by the 1920s, the firms are relatively small. And they were literally sitting around. Look at the cartoon over here. They're sitting at their sewing machines. They're sitting on the sewing machines, on the tables, and eating their sandwiches and schmoozing, as one of the newspapers said. Yeah, Gail.
I was just wondering what you discovered about the issues of egress, because I know in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire there was a problem with fire stairs, in addition to the lack of what you later showed to be sprinklers. But then I noticed, in looking at one of the plans in the garment district, there were these things not called fire stairs, but fire towers.
Well, some of the buildings have actually separate towers next to the building that are actually open, and that was they were less expensive because they didn't have to be fully fireproofed, but they were safer than the fire escapes, because the fire escapes collapsed at the Triangle fire because of too much weight. So there are multiple stairs in these buildings, and they could have inside fire stairs, or they could have these outside fire towers to them. Yeah. Yes.
In so many of the photographs of the garment district from the 20s onward, right up through, say, the 50s, when it was still pretty active there, you see enormous numbers of people hunched over the sewing machines and the cutters and so on. Were there occupancy rates established, and were they enforced, or were there no occupancy rates? Because
no, there were occupancy rates.
Literally cheap by general.
After the Triangle fire, there were occupancy rates. That was one of the reform laws, that how many people you could have per square foot, and the union was very strong on that, and the ILGWU was very, very, very strong, and they monitored conditions in the factories very closely. If they were a union shop, and there were non-union shops, cockroach shops, not so much in the district, but in outlying areas. So these were fairly well monitored, these shops, but there were minimum square footage but it was minimal. I mean, you know, it wasn't spacious. You can see how crowded they are in the photographs. Yeah.
On each other's laps,
Yeah.
almost.
Yeah, Kate.
I was just wondering if you had found kind of any correlation between the kind of manufacturers. I mean, I imagine that the same manufacturers that were producing kind of more simple garments would not be the same people who would produce kind of a higher end garment. So I was wondering if you saw some kind of correlation between the kind of spaces they occupied or the buildings that they occupied and the kind of garments that they made.
Well, you're absolutely right. The firms specialized. And in fact, in the showroom buildings, you have buildings that would be, the showroom buildings tended to cluster the similar businesses with a similar market so that the buyers could come to one building. So you'll have a building that sold high-end dresses, and then you'll have a building that sold low-end dresses. And so the different businesses do congregate. But just because somebody was selling low-end dresses didn't mean that it was less profitable than selling the high-end dresses. So the low-end dresses might also be, the showrooms might also be in beautiful buildings because they wanted to appeal to the buyers. They needed to sell maybe 1,000 dresses rather than 50 dresses if they were selling to the low end. The factories are more mixed. Different companies specialized in doing low end or high end, but you could find a high end dress company on one floor and a low end dress company on another floor. Although the other day when we had our opening, somebody said 35th Street was known for its low end dresses, dress manufacturing. So that could be part of it. If it was really high end, like if you needed embroidery, that went out to another shop. That's why all these things are going back and forth on the carts, because you sent dresses out to be embroidered someplace else. Yes?
What are some of the uses now of the building since,
there's a lot of media businesses, architecture and design firms, lawyers, all the white-collar businesses you'd expect in New York. There's still a lot of showroom-type garment businesses. The offices of big garment firms are still there. And if you walk around, especially at dusk, you can see there is still some active industry. And you can tell if the windows are dirty and there's fabric leaning against the window, then it's probably a factory. All right, well, thank you all.